Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a world where a whisper could destroy your life, where neighbors turned against neighbors and fear ruled over reason. This was not a tale of monsters from myths, but a chilling reality of Europe's darkest past. The witch hunts, a time when suspicion, superstition, and sheer terror set entire towns ablaze. Thousands were accused, tortured, and executed not for crimes, but for shadows of fear. Tonight, we open the hidden book of Europe's haunted history, where fire met faith, where superstition silenced science, and where innocent lives were forever lost. These are not just old stories, they are warnings carved into time itself, and if you think you've heard it all, prepare yourself. What you're about to discover is far stranger, far more terrifying, and far more fascinating than any movie you've ever seen. So before we dive deep into these mysteries, make sure to subscribe, like, and comment below, because your voice helps keep history alive. And together we'll uncover truths the world tried to bury beneath the cold skies of medieval Europe. Whispers carried more weight than truth. A single murmur, a fleeting glance, or a sudden illness could ignite suspicion that someone in the village had made a pact with forces beyond comprehension. This was the spark of fear, invisible, untouchable, yet powerful enough to topple lives in an instant. It did not begin with evidence or reason, it began with uncertainty, with the unexplained events that haunted daily existence. A cow stopped giving milk. A child fell without cause. A storm destroyed crops overnight. To the desperate and frightened, these were not accidents of nature, they were curses. And when fear has no answers, it invents them. The invention, tragically, was the witch. Picture a small European village in the 15th century. The houses are modest, the streets are narrow, and everyone knows one another. In these close-knit communities, reputation was everything. A woman who lived alone, a widow who healed with herbs, or an old man who spoke to himself in the fields, all stood on fragile ground. Their oddities became dangerous once fear began to spread. The unexplainable needed someone to blame, and these outsiders became perfect targets. Fear was contagious. Once a neighbor whispered that misfortune was caused by witchcraft, the thought spread like fire in dry grass. Before long, the village no longer saw the healer or the widow as a neighbor. They saw her as the enemy within. This spark of fear was not just local gossip, it was fueled by the very institutions meant to protect. Preachers thundered from the pulpits about the devil's presence, warning that he walked among ordinary people, cloaked in the skin of friends and family. Authorities issued decrees declaring that witchcraft was a crime against God and man. What had once been rumor was now backed by law, and fear was given legitimacy. Ordinary disputes, a boundary disagreement, a quarrel over livestock, jealousy between neighbors became deadly weapons when framed as accusations of witchcraft. If a person was difficult, disliked, or simply too different, the whisper was enough. She is a witch, and the whisper grew louder with every unexplained death, every poor harvest, every sudden storm. Soon fear shaped the way people lived. Windows were shuttered tighter at night. Charms were hung over doorways. Prayers were spoken with trembling lips. The line between religion and superstition blurred until they were indistinguishable. The spark of fear burned brighter, casting long shadows over every act, every glance, every misfortune. It was no longer about what happened, it was about who could be blamed. What made this fear so devastating was its invisibility. There was no monster to slay, no army to fight, no fortress to defend. The enemy lived in the imagination and wore the face of the neighbor next door. Fear stripped away trust, leaving only suspicion in its place. Families turned against one another. Children testified against parents. Friends accused friends. To be accused was to be condemned, for who could prove they had not consorted with unseen forces? Silence was suspicious. Anger was proof. Even defense was twisted into guilt. Fear had created a world where innocence no longer existed, only degrees of suspicion. This was the true horror of the witch hunts, not fire and torture alone, but the way fear hollowed out communities from within. A single spark could burn down an entire village's trust, and that spark was not always born from grand conspiracies. Sometimes it was as simple as envy, as small as a grudge, as quiet as a whisper. Yet in an age where superstition was stronger than science, whispers were louder than truth. This was how the witch hunts began, not with flames, but with fear, invisible, contagious, and unstoppable once lit. Behind the cobblestone streets and towering cathedrals of Europe, there stood something invisible yet unshakable, a wall not built of stone or mortar, but of fear and superstition. This wall shaped the lives of millions, dictating who could be trusted, who was condemned, and who might be the next victim. It was made of beliefs handed down for centuries. Beliefs that whispered the devil's hand was everywhere, pulling the strings of ordinary misfortunes. To the people of that age, sickness was not caused by disease, but by curses. Failed harvests were not blamed on weather, but on dark forces hidden in the village. Behind every tragedy, they saw an unseen enemy, and that enemy often wore the face of someone they already distrusted. Superstition was not a choice, it was survival. In a world with no scientific answers, people turned to explanations that fit their fears. When lightning struck a church tower, it was said to be the devil mocking God. When a child was born with a deformity, it was whispered that the mother had danced with demons. The more mysterious the world appeared, the higher the wall of superstition grew. Priests warned of witches in their sermons. Pamphlets circulated with gruesome illustrations of women flying on broomsticks or feasting with Satan. These images imprinted themselves into the minds of ordinary people, strengthening the belief that evil was hiding in plain sight. And once the wall was built, it was nearly impossible to tear down. Superstition dictated everyday life. A black cat crossing the path was a sign of bad luck. A neighbor's bread not rising in the oven was a signal that witchcraft was at work. Even simple illnesses like fevers or headaches were attributed to curses cast in the night. Families tied charms above their doors, carried herbs for protection, and prayed over fields before planting seeds. These acts gave comfort, but they also reinforced the idea that danger was always near. Fear was baked into routine, and routine became ritual. What made this wall unbreakable was that authority stood behind it. Scholars wrote lengthy manuals on how to identify witches. These books listed supposed signs: a strange birthmark, an unusual pet, a habit of muttering to oneself. Priests thundered that witches served Satan directly, poisoning wells and corrupting communities. Judges accepted confessions drawn from torture as undeniable truth. The weight of superstition became law, and law gave superstition the strength of chains. The wall was no longer just in the minds of the people, it was etched into the very fabric of society. Inside this wall of superstition, anyone could be trapped. A woman who healed with herbs might be praised in one moment and condemned in the next. A widow living alone might be pitied on Monday, then accused of calling storms by Thursday. The criteria for guilt were so vague, so tied to rumor and fear, that innocence itself had no defense. To deny the accusations was seen as proof of the devil's cunning. To confess under torture was taken as confirmation of guilt. Once suspicion fell upon someone, the wall closed in around them, leaving no way out. This was the true strength of superstition, its power to bind entire societies in silence. Those who doubted kept quiet, for to question the wall was to risk being accused of siding with the devil. Even the powerful were not immune. Nobles, priests, and scholars found themselves vulnerable if the tide of suspicion turned against them. Fear became both the brick and the mortar of this wall, and no one dared to challenge its foundation. And so, generation after generation, Europe lived under its shadow. What began as fear of the unknown hardened into rules of life, trapping whole communities in cycles of suspicion and blood. The wall of superstition stood taller than any fortress because it was built inside the human mind. It needed no soldiers to guard it, no gates to lock it, only belief, whisper, and fear. Once raised, it loomed over everything, casting shadows that stretched for centuries. The courtroom was never a place of justice during the witch hunts. It was a stage, and fear was the script. Once suspicion fell upon someone, the machinery of accusation turned into a deadly performance. Trials were not about finding the truth, but about confirming what the community already believed, that the devil was at work. The accused entered the room not as an equal, but as a condemned soul, and everything that followed was designed to strip away their humanity until guilt was the only possible outcome. Imagine a dim hall lit by flickering candles, crowded with neighbors whispering nervously. At the center, a woman is brought in, her wrists bound tightly, her face pale with terror. She has been accused of bewitching cattle, of soaring milk, of calling storms to ruin crops. These claims sound absurd to modern ears, yet in that world they carried the weight of death. The judges did not ask if witchcraft was real, they asked how deeply she was involved. Each question was a trap. If she denied the charges, it was said the devil gave her strength to lie. If she hesitated or wept, it was proof she was hiding something. Even silence could betray her. But the cruelty did not end with words. Behind the courtroom doors, darker rituals unfolded, rituals of pain masquerading as justice. Torture was the key that unlocked confessions, and it was wielded with terrifying creativity. Accused witches were stretched on racks until their bones threatened to break, pressed with crushing weights upon their chests, or forced into sleeplessness for days until exhaustion shattered their minds. In their agony, they confessed to whatever their tormentors demanded. They admitted to flying at night, to meeting demons in the forest, to signing pacts in blood. Fantasies whispered to them until the line between imagination and reality blurred. And once the confession was spoken, it was sealed as truth, written down, and used as evidence. The trials did not stop at confessions. There were tests, cruel performances meant to reveal guilt by supernatural signs. Some were forced into water, bound hand and foot, and thrown into rivers. If they floated, it was said the water, being pure, rejected them, proving they were witches. If they sank and drowned, they were declared innocent. Though their innocence came too late, others were examined for a so-called witch's mark, a blemish or birthmark believed to be the devil's brand. Entire bodies were pricked with needles to find spots that did not bleed, taken as undeniable proof of guilt. These spectacles convinced the public they were witnessing justice, when in truth they were watching cruelty disguised as righteousness. The trials also served another purpose. They reassured the community that fear was justified. Every confession confirmed the sermons, the pamphlets, the whispers that witches lived among them. Every execution seemed to cleanse the town of evil, until the next misfortune struck and the hunt began anew. The cycle fed upon itself, making the trials not a cure for fear, but its fuel. Each victim's screams echoed through the village, reminding everyone that suspicion could fall on anyone. What made these trials most terrifying was their finality. Once accused, escape was nearly impossible. Friends abandoned the accused to save themselves. Families turned away in shame or fear. The courtroom walls closed in like a coffin, and the outcome was nearly always the same: a death sentence disguised as divine justice. The legacy of these trials is not only in the ashes of those burned or the graves of those hanged, but in the silence they left behind. Entire generations learned that truth could be twisted, that pain could masquerade as proof, and that justice could be nothing more than fear dressed in robes. The trials were not simply legal proceedings, They were a theater of terror, and every act ended with the same haunting curtain fall. In the dim corners of Europe's villages, where fear had already spread like smoke, one group became the most frequent victims of suspicion. Women who did not fit neatly into society's fragile order were often the first to be accused. A widow living alone at the edge of town, a midwife who helped bring children into the world, a healer who gathered herbs in the woods, all became easy targets when the whisper witchcraft passed from mouth to mouth. In a world built upon rigid expectations, anyone who stepped outside them, by choice or by circumstance, was marked as different, and in times of fear, different became dangerous. The women most often accused shared little in common beyond their vulnerability. The elderly, with wrinkled faces and failing bodies, carried the weight of suspicion simply because they were seen as closer to death and therefore closer to the devil's hand. Their age made them dependent on others, but it also made them visible when something went wrong. If a cow stopped giving milk near their cottage, it was not nature's fault. It was the old woman's curse. If bread spoiled, if a child sickened, the blame fell easily upon the weak and the voiceless. Midwives and healers, too, stood on precarious ground. Their knowledge of herbs, of childbirth, of remedies passed down through generations was both needed and feared. Villagers relied on them in desperate moments, but when tragedy struck, when a mother died in labor, or a child failed to survive its first winter, suspicion turned quickly into accusation. How could a woman wield such power over life and death without the devil's aid? To the fearful, healing became witchcraft, and compassion became evidence of a pact with dark forces. It was not only the elderly or the healers. Women who were outspoken, who did not bow their heads in silence, found themselves at risk. In a world where obedience was demanded, independence became a threat. A woman who argued with her neighbor, who resisted the control of men, or who lived without the protection of a husband could be branded as dangerous. Jealousy and rivalry added fuel to the fire. If a man's crop failed while his neighbor prospered, if a woman's child fell ill while another's thrived, envy searched for a reason. The answer, whispered in fearful tones, was always the same: witchcraft. Men, too, were sometimes accused, though in far fewer numbers. Yet even when they were, the accusations often tied back to women. A man might be denounced as a witch because of his association with an accused woman, or because he practiced trades seen as mysterious, alchemy, fortune-telling, or healing. But the overwhelming majority of victims were female, their lives tangled in the web of suspicion simply because society already viewed them as weaker, stranger, or more expendable. The tragedy deepened in the way these accusations reinforced themselves. Once one woman was accused, others soon followed. Her friends, her family, her neighbors all came under suspicion. If she confessed under torture, she was often forced to name others to spread the web wider. Fear multiplied like shadows at dusk, stretching across entire communities. What began as the targeting of one vulnerable woman could sweep through a town like a plague, pulling dozens into its grasp. These women carried not only the burden of accusation, but also the burden of silence. To be accused was to lose one's voice, for protest was dismissed as the devil's trickery. To remain calm was suspicious, to cry out was suspicious, to say nothing was suspicious. Their every breath, every gesture, every word became twisted into proof against them. And so innocence itself became invisible, erased by the fear of those who demanded an explanation for their misfortunes. In the end, these women were not condemned for crimes committed, but for their place on the margins of society. They became symbols of the unknown, scapegoats upon whom the community could heap its fear, its envy, and its grief. The hunts did not simply burn individuals, they burned away trust, leaving scars in families and villages that lasted for generations. The women who were targeted remind us of a haunting truth: when fear rules, the most vulnerable always pay the highest price. The day of execution was not hidden in the shadows, it was paraded before the world. In towns and villages across Europe, the burning pyres became both punishment and spectacle, a ritual meant to cleanse communities of their fear. When the word spread that a witch was to be executed, crowds gathered, families brought children. Merchants set up stalls. What should have been a moment of dread became entertainment, and in those moments, fear transformed into fire. Imagine the scene: a wooden stake driven into the ground, surrounded by a heap of straw and branches piled high. The accused, weary from days of torture and interrogation, was led into the square. Shackled, bruised, and broken, she stood not as a human being, but as a symbol, the embodiment of everything the village wished to destroy. The crowd pressed closer, whispering, some crossing themselves in prayer, others sneering with relief that the evil was being purged. The air was heavy with smoke before the first spark was struck, as if the town itself was holding its breath. For the accused, the final moments were a blur of terror and silence. Many confessed once more in desperation, praying for mercy that never came. Others cried out, declaring innocence until the flames swallowed their voices. Some resigned themselves, whispering prayers, clinging to faith even as the crowd saw them as damned. And when the fire caught, when the smoke curled skyward, the audience leaned in, watching flesh and fear burn together, convinced they were witnessing justice. Yet these executions were not simply about punishing an individual, they were designed to send a message. The flames spoke louder than any sermon: disobey, defy, or stray from the norm, and you too could meet this fate. The burning pyres were warnings carved into memory, a spectacle that etched itself into the minds of everyone who watched. Parents clutched their children tighter, teaching them to conform, to stay silent, to never stand apart. Fear was reinforced not only through law and trial, but through these very public spectacles of death. The burning pyres also served another purpose. They gave the community a false sense of cleansing. Misfortunes were not solved by executions, but in the haze of firelight it felt as if evil had been banished. Crops would grow again, storms would pass, sickness would fade, or so they believed. Each execution became a ritual of reassurance, an illusion that order had been restored. But soon enough, another illness, another storm, another tragedy would strike, and the hunt would begin again. The fire that promised safety only fueled the cycle of fear. For those who watched, the memory of the flames lingered long after the embers died. The sight of a neighbor consumed by fire, the smell of burning flesh, the cries echoing in the night, these were scars imprinted on entire communities. Yet rather than turn hearts to pity, these memories often hardened suspicion. If one which could be found, surely there were more hiding. Each burning seemed to justify the next, each pyre building upon the ashes of the last. And so the fire spread across Europe, not just in wood and flame, but in fear and belief. From Germany to Scotland, from France to Poland, thousands of stakes were raised, each one casting its glow into the night sky. The executions became part of the landscape of life, a grim rhythm that marked the years. Innocent people were reduced to ash, their names erased, their lives remembered only as warnings. But behind the spectacle there was always something unspoken. Some in the crowd surely doubted. Some surely questioned whether the condemned had truly been guilty, whether the fire had consumed innocence as well as evil. Yet fear silenced those thoughts. To voice them was to risk joining the flames. And so the cycle continued unbroken, each pyre built upon silence, each flame fed by superstition. The burning pyres were not just acts of execution, they were the heartbeat of the witch hunts, the fiery proof that fear had triumphed over compassion, over reason, over truth itself. And long after the flames turned to ashes, the shadows they cast would haunt Europe for centuries. When the fires finally dimmed and the screams faded into echoes of memory, Europe was left with silence. But it was not a silence of peace, it was the silence of absence. Villages had lost mothers, daughters, wives, and friends. Communities that once leaned on healers and midwives were left without their guidance. Entire families carried scars of shame, their names forever branded with the accusation of witchcraft. Even when the execution slowed, the shadow of fear lingered, woven into the fabric of daily life. People did not speak openly of what had been done, but the wounds lived in whispers, in the empty chairs at supper tables, in the hollow places where laughter had once been. The aftermath was not marked by sudden enlightenment. The beliefs that fueled the hunts did not vanish with the smoke. They dissolved slowly, painfully, like embers dying in the dark. The rise of science and reason began to chip away at the wall of superstition. Doctors uncovered the real causes of disease. Astronomers charted the skies with accuracy, and philosophers dared to question the nature of truth. Slowly, explanations rooted in evidence began to replace those born of fear. Yet even as reason took root, the memory of the hunt stood as a warning, a reminder of what happens when fear is given more power than understanding. In the centuries that followed, governments and churches distanced themselves from the bloodshed, but the weight of responsibility never disappeared. Manuals of witch hunting were quietly set aside, trials dwindled, executions became rare. By the 18th century, Europe had largely turned its back on the flames, but not on the memory. Some regions issued apologies centuries too late for the lives unjustly taken. Others left the stories buried, as if silence could erase guilt. Yet the legacy remained etched into folklore, into cautionary tales, into the hushed voices of families who knew their ancestors had been condemned. The greatest lesson of the aftermath was not written in books, but in the very fabric of society. The witch hunts revealed how quickly fear could destroy trust, how suspicion could unravel communities, how reason could be silenced by superstition. It showed the fragility of justice when built upon fear instead of truth. And though the executions ended, the capacity for hysteria, the dangerous power of mass suspicion, did not disappear. It lay dormant, waiting for new forms, new targets, new excuses to rise again. Today, when we look back on the witch hunts of Europe, we see more than flames and trials. We see a mirror, a reflection of how fear can turn ordinary people into accusers, how silence can make neighbors complicit, how belief without evidence can destroy countless lives. The aftermath teaches us not only about the past, but about ourselves, that ignorance and fear, if left unchecked, can ignite again. The victims of those dark centuries, nameless and voiceless in so many records, deserve more than to be remembered as witches. They deserve to be remembered as human beings, as mothers, daughters, healers, and friends whose lives were stolen by fear. Their ashes remind us of the cost of forgetting, the cost of silence, the cost of superstition. And so, the story of the witch hunts does not truly end with the last burning pyre. It ends with us, with the way we remember, the way we learn, and the way we choose to protect truth over fear. Let their memory be a warning, let their suffering be a lesson, and let their voices silenced by fire echo forever in ours. For in the end, history is not just about what happened then, it is about what we choose to carry forward now.